Okay.
Okay, so so now we're still just chatting, Arta, because I can cut the beginning of this.
Right. Well, I've been wanting to talk about the financials for a long time because what we have here is just a small family business, the piece of land, but it had to be capitalized. So as long as Doral was alive, he used his personal money to pay all the bills. But when he was dying, he left a little bit of money for me in the bank to pay bills with. And he also wanted to have Glenn finish school. So the money that he had was not distributed to everyone until about 4 years later. When Glenn finished school, then that debt was paid back to the government, whatever he owed, and whatever Doral owned was then divided 8 ways and distributed to everyone in the family, with a little bit left to capitalize LaRue. LaRue also became capitalized along the way when the government was taking some of the road allowance. So there was a deal made there. Rather than go to litigation, than to fight the government when they're coming through, you just give them land that they need for roads. So we got paid for that. And at the same time, they took off trees, so they paid us for that. So and all that money was invested in about the early 1980s and late 1970s, when interest rates were about 18%. So LaRue became capitalized until it finally had $140,000. We also assessed shareholders, which you now know can't be done, but which people were willing to pay. Then the foe took over in 2003, and Earl, being a businessman and had run several businesses, saw that money and decided to use it in the company. So he was getting ready to make money. He was making lots. He was going to bring in electricity. He brought in a digger. And all of this was causing a lot of stress to those of us who didn't know exactly what he was doing. We could see that he was spending money, and he began litigation against us. And we could see that LaRue money was being used in litigation against us. So we had no, I'll call it conscience, about having him have audited statements, because we knew just get rid of that money until the company had no money, because he was using it to fight us, and we were bloodied by that time. I wanted to tell you one other interesting thing about the financials. Earl went through the years that I'd probably had total control of the company. No one else was interested, so I just kept paying the bills. And he went back to find ways that I had cheated people, but he couldn't find anything. And still he began to spread lies that I had taken money from the company. My one brother, Glenn, looked at the documents Earl produced and said after the first page, "Oh, none of this is documented, and we know X, Y, and Z aren't true, so I'm just going to discount everything Earl says." But Earl went among family and friends spreading lies, saying I'd stolen money, I'd stolen $100,000, I'd used company money to buy my windows. But when people went to look for documentation, there was none. When they went
And by
back to him and said, "Well,
documentation
it's not
here,
documented,"
sorry, Arta, by documentation,
pardon?
I just wanted, so the document Earl was
Oh,
giving to
there
people.
was, well, there were no checks where I'd taken money. There were no withdrawals from the bank. There were no checks written to me. There was nothing that I had bought or sold. In fact, I was very careful to use used folders that I got from my work when people didn't want the file folders anymore and were throwing them out. Then I brought them home to reuse them for LaRue. So I was ultra frugal in those days, never spending money. And of course, the others who came to look were right. The only times I charged the company were maybe at the end of the year for all the stamps I'd used, or was very thrifty.
But the document Earl
But
had, so
he said,
Earl, right?
the documents, well, this is what Earl finally said to people. Arta is so smart that she's hidden all the ways she's stolen money because I can't find any. And for some people, that was good evidence, Earl's word that he'd looked and was sure that I had cheated my brothers and sisters in that way. I just find that a family will split up and some people will want to believe the worst about a person and some people want, I'm not saying the others wanted to believe the best, but they just couldn't believe badly of me because there was nothing that Earl could present that would prove I had hurt anyone in any way. I think that's the end. Do you want to know anything more?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the interesting things doing work with business associations, I'm thinking about being the students and being in your office and having someone come in to tell you a story. So it's a real challenge to figure out what are the pieces of the story that you need to understand, because how to tell the story is really complicated. So the story of the financials for LaRue, and the way you're just telling it, if we looked at the 1982 balance sheets, which we could do with the students, it just doesn't really show very much liquidity in the company. So you can just see the land on one side, the promissory notes on the other side, and there's not much in the company. So there's that. But Earl, and then as you've said, the money does come in. So there is like $150,000 in the company because land is sold, trees are sold, and there is a piece of off the books material, and that is Doral actively tried to die with no assets. So he divested himself of everything before he died. Now, there's two ways to tell that story too, because when you were saying about he wanted to leave money for Glenn to finish his school, for example, Doral didn't set up a will or a trust where those monies were, to put off the probate of his will until these things were done. He did it on the basis of trust. So he sold his house and he gave that money to others. So that money was put in the hands of Darla. That money was put in the hands of Richard, my Uncle Richard, and me. So I held part of that money during those years under an agreement from where my grandfather had a notarized document that he had given that money to me. So it was legally my money, but I knew, as did the other people who would have paid tax at a low rate, who was given that money, that we actually could have spent that money. There was nothing legally that would have stopped us from just spending that money on ourselves, including Darla. But everyone understood that their dad had a want, and so they acted on the basis of that want. But in hindsight, Earl wanted to track that money in a different way and sort of believed there was some entitlement to it. So Earl constructed that story as a story of fraud or deceit, believing that that money, which then all returned to was divided, once Glenn's education had been paid for, as the youngest child of with a dead mother, the one young person who hadn't been cared for, whose father couldn't stay to see that through, right? Him having taken care of all the other kids in this way. So you have this hindsight at the end that we see show up in the documents where Earl keeps saying, all the money that Doral had at his death has been hidden, right? And has been stolen and spent by Arta. So this is the story he tells, though all that money can be tracked, but it's totally independent of LaRue, has nothing to do with LaRue, right? I'm thinking about your story of this account of the ways that people caregive and trust for things. Someone who doesn't believe that things on the basis of trust and responsibility and obligation to each other, right, then recounts a story of the past where there is no documentation for that story other than his imagination. Right? Does that?
Yeah, I would like to say one other thing, just to keep the conversation about money small, is that the only money there was the money of a small bungalow that he had built for $7,000 in 1946. And now it was sold in 1982. So the money he got there was just divided 8 ways. So it wasn't probably, it wasn't that much money that we're talking about. And you're right that the money was put in your name, Richard's name, some was in Earl's name. And I think Bonnie Waiora, I had quite a few people holding that money until Glenn had finished school. And then the money was all gathered back together, divided 8 ways, and disposed of. So everybody knew that they'd had their 1/8 of that house. And still Earl could construct that all that money should again become LaRue's, but nobody thought, oh, we'll have to draw it back in from the people who now have it. That conversation couldn't even occur because a split in the family occurred. An odd split because people didn't divide by gender. They didn't divide by those who are religious and those who are not religious. They didn't divide by age with the oldest against the youngest. When we look at it, there's no way we can figure out what happened. In fact, something kind of, I'll call it miraculous, because Doral had 8 children and he managed to fund or let them stand on his shoulders until all of them have an undergraduate degree, which is just, I couldn't get that to happen in my family. It's very rare, either because of capacity or other things get in the way. But I just raised my hands to Doral that he could establish in us in the 1940s and 50s that both men and women needed educations. The end.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very strange. We've talked a little bit before about, we've been thinking about the trauma-informed lawyering piece, like how the students might think about the kind of work they do with business associations, because people tend to talk about business associations as if it's really something quite different from criminal law or family law, where you might need to be careful or thoughtful or attentive to the trauma that your client might have. But yeah, so if you're thinking about the question of what would be helpful for students to know about the way clients come in, just thinking about your own experience as a client of a lawyer, what are some of the things that you would have them know? Because I'm going to give them now documents about the first time when we finally go to the lawyers to try and stop things. So the 2005 decision to say, we're done. Wonder if you can put yourself back into that place of being a client.
I've been thinking about that story. For me, it starts like this. We didn't need a lawyer until I made the mistake of going to the registry and having Bonnie's name taken off as a director. She, the same day, went to the registry to figure out who were directors, found that I had done that, called my brother Earl, and together they went to see Mr. Tingle. This is the first time that LaRue ever hired a lawyer. So they had a meeting, which Rebecca has described to you last week. And I was called to the meeting, and he explained that he'd been through the books, that they needed a little tweaking. There was a number of ways this could be fixed. Earl wanted to take me off as a director, and Mr. Tingle said that wouldn't be possible, but that I could be removed as the secretary, which is what I was then. And so I was removed that day as the secretary and still a director. And Earl went about making LaRue into a thriving business in his mind. So his first job was to come back and make a lot license that everyone would have to sign in his mind. When we questioned Mr. Tingle about this at the 2003 meeting, he said that he would construct a draft of a lot license that would be good for all of us, and that all we would have to do is write to him and tell him what we wanted in the lot license. So the four of us independently wrote to him. And when we got together afterwards and asked, what did you write in the license, had wanted a fair dispute resolution written into the lot license. That's the only thing we care about. So Mr. Tingle wrote the license, gave it to the directors. Then Earl changed it. And when the lot license came back to us, there was a draconian method of dispute resolution written into the license. So of course we weren't going to sign that. At the same time, Earl went out and had to survey the land, because in the lot license, you have to attach the lot to a certain area of the land that's been surveyed. When Earl went out to survey, he sent all of us a draft of the survey he'd done. When we looked at it, we saw that he'd cut off a corner of Earl's lot, that he'd
Glenn's
made
lot.
Darla's lot a third bigger, and that he'd himself a lot a half bigger. As well, they assigned the prime back lots to themselves and gave us lots, some of which have no road access to the lot. This was too much for Wyana, and she called the lawyer and asked if she could come down and see him. So Mr. Tingle said yes, he was the corporate lawyer, and we could come in and talk to him. So she brought the map and showed him what was happening. He said to her, I'm privy to information that only should go to the directors, so I can't tell you any of that, but I can tell you that if you want to litigate about this, which you probably should, you'll have to do it in the next 2 weeks or so, because they're ready to sign their lot licenses. And after the licenses are signed, there's not much you can do about changing the lot lines. We were distraught. Mr. Tingle said he would give us the name of some litigation lawyers, but that he didn't litigate. We went home and called Rebecca. Rebecca said she would ask around. She asked at the law firm with which she had articled, and came back and told us, yes, there was a fellow there named Grant, and maybe we should go see Grant. So we made an appointment to go see Grant, taking him all of our concerns, I'll say. And after looking at it, Grant told us that he thought we didn't have a case. We wanted to argue that the directors are oppressing us. And Grant told us he didn't think that we could win. But he thought that maybe the word is we are blocked.
Deadlock.
What is the word, Rebecca?
Deadlock.
I've forgotten.
Deadlock.
Exactly. Deadlock. Sounded like this. Sounded like a wrestling metaphor to me. So there we were, finally in the court. making this argument to Justice Mahoney. We had called all our friends and neighbors and children, and our side of the courtroom was packed with people. And on their side, there were just 3 people. I can remember the lawyer that Darla Earl and Bonnie had called stood up, and then he looked around, and then he just stared at everyone. I'd never seen anybody do that in Law and Order, so it kind of made me nervous. But the case was presented, and then Justice Mahoney told us what he thought. And then the case was over, but we didn't understand anything that had gone on in the court. So we went out in the hall with Grant, and Grant was almost dancing. And he said, well, I didn't think this would happen, but yes, he gave us a deadlock decision of sorts. And there's an injunction now that the directors can't do anything but ordinary business. So there would be no tearing down of the cabins and other things that were on Earl's agenda. Now, that's how we got lawyers. Later, in the lawyering, I'll call them the faux still. The faux argued that we couldn't speak for LaRue, which is true. LaRue needed its own corporate lawyer to go to court. So that felt like an extra burden, because now we had to pay one lawyer in the oppression case, and then we had to pay another lawyer to speak for LaRue in court.
Yeah, I'll say something about that.
I've forgotten.
No, that's.
I want to say one more thing about that. My turn first. When we go back and make a list of all the lawyers that they've hired and that we've hired, as you know, some are dead and some have gone to court and some have gone to jail, but mostly we've just been able to move through all of these lawyers. I think there's at least 16. That's a lot of lawyering for a little company who went 20 years with no lawyers.
It's a lot of lawyers. We have really funded the legal profession, and we should get an award for service above and beyond to the halls of the law schools. So just so you guys know. On the money front, one of the things we haven't really made visible maybe to the students is this. A corporation can only act through a solicitor. So if a corporation goes to court, it must hire a lawyer to represent it. So in the litigation bouncing that we're going to see that happens, when Arta got called into Richard Tingle's office by the directors to say, we're removing you as an officer, that was paid for from LaRue funds because it's LaRue's action. When the directors then took Arta, Moya, Wyona, and Glenn to court in small claims in BC, which we'll show you those documents, LaRue, its lawyer is paid for, but for the 4 of them, they had to individually fund the costs of litigation themselves. So partly what was also happening, and I think this is another way of saying what you heard Arta say earlier, is LaRue was using the money available to it within its capitalized funds to bring a legal action against the 4 of them to make them pay funds, even though the lawyer had told Earl, you can't make them pay. But he could make them pay lawyers' costs. So they had kind of a choice. Do they go to court and hire lawyers, which is going to be very costly, or do they go to court without lawyers and represent themselves, which is also, I mean, it's costly even if you don't have a lawyer, because you still have to file documents, figure out how to do all the work. So the corporation was able to use funds to support themselves in using a lawyer against the other side to require them to pay some form of costs. So if they wouldn't pay for the license, they would have to pay in some other fashion. So there's this question about who pays for the lawyer. Now, in the current mode, where the corporation is being sued by Darla, I mean, this is the point, that Earl was suing the corporation and suing the directors individually. And so the directors needed their own lawyers individually, as well as a lawyer for the corporation. So it's double lawyers then that are being required, rather than their side allowing one lawyer to represent both the corporation and the shareholders. So you can see that there are these strategies involved that aren't really about the issue that's going to be litigated. And you all will know this from seeing this in your other courses as well, but just noting kind of the strategic deployment of lawyering in an aggressive form, like using law as a sword against someone else, versus what's available to you when you are trying to use the law as a shield and you've got no choice but to defend yourself. But the defense comes with the need to hire lawyers for the corporation and lawyers for you to defend yourself against a lawsuit. So you can't self-represent a corporation when someone's coming after you. So there are these questions you will be wanting to think about, including, kind of what access to resources do your clients have, either through their corporate forms or through their individual forms. Arta, I wonder if you can throw yourself back to 2005, because the four of you made an active so you've talked about the decision to go to the lawyer on deadlock. I find myself reflecting back on some other advice that Grant gave at the time. I wonder if you have any thoughts on. I recall Grant saying to the group, not only, you don't really have a good case for oppression, but I think at the time he also told us what it would cost to go to court.
Yeah, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about the cost to go to court. I've forgotten the other. I'll maybe remember it later. Okay, we got together with the lawyer and he explained the cost of going to court. And he said sometimes it might cost as much as $100,000. For me, I looked at my piece of property and I looked at my life and my idea of retiring, knowing that I'd be on a fixed income. And it seemed to me that what he was telling me is that there would be heavy court costs and we still might lose. And I can remember saying to him, if we're going to lose and I'm going to have to pay all that money, maybe I should just walk away right now, say goodbye, just kind of tell the corporation, I'm out, you do whatever you wish, I'll just give up my right to be there. And Grant said, oh, I'm not telling you to do that. He said, if you believe that what you're doing is right, then you should fight for it. I'm just trying to explain to you the cost that it will be to make this fight.
I recall at one point him also telling the four of us, or the four, I'm not one of the four, but the four people that I loved so dearly, telling the four to consider just selling the property at the lake, letting the other half just cut the baby in half, take that money, and then go buy a different place in the Slocan Valley or something with just the four of us. So one of the options he gave us was just set yourself down, get a divorce basically from your family, divorce them, and then just the four of you find a new piece of land and settle on that. And I remember at the time thinking, and I still think this, on the one hand, that's like That's affirming the importance of the relationships of the four. On the other hand, it's a severing of the relationship to the particular land, like as if the particular land is just a commodity, just a place for other things to happen, and not a place that relationships, networks, memories, home had been inscribed into. But becomes very interesting. You will have clients in front of you who are facing that set of questions, like, is the place just a resource? Is the cost of litigation just captured in, can it be commodified in this way so you can say it will be cheaper for you not to litigate, instead to just separate, to walk away, and to reattach yourself to another place? But what Grant said about the costs of litigation have absolutely borne themselves out and more. That those amounts of money have been, people have had to generate them, and generate them not through the corporation, but through personal funds, in order to hold their pin to the place.
Yeah, we did talk a lot about Earl's solution, which is just sell everything and divide it up and everybody leave. And I had to think myself, why am I doing this? And one reason is here's this land, but we've just carved off a little bit of it to live on, but there's still 40 acres for everyone to enjoy. And it seems that I was fighting for that too. And that is preserving the land in its natural state, and then having everyone enjoy it, having your friends come and your family come, and people you don't know and people you do know, and everyone walking in the forest. That seemed really important. Glenn said to me, everybody has a price, Arta. So think hard. What would be your price? What's the tipping point? If Earl said, because Earl was promising that he could sell this and he could get $2 million for every person, and they could still keep their house. So that was a big draw for the people who believed in him. They thought the rest of us were crazy not to go for Earl's deal. The ones on my side kind of looked at what the government estimates the land is worth. And if we sold it at that price, and not the speculation price that Earl was promising, that it wouldn't be much more than getting everybody a brand new, really good car. So seemed to us, we couldn't buy into his dream, but I still was looking for a price. And I couldn't come to one. I finally told Glenn, no, for me, it's priceless. Any amount of money that's within any amount of money, if you give me that, I would just have to go buy another place just like this. So what's the use of that for me? And Glenn just told me, no, Arta, everybody has a price. But about 3 or 4 years later, he came to me one evening, and I'd seen him. He was down at the lake with his grandchildren, little babies, so like a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and he was tending them, and they were throwing rocks together in the water. And he came to me and said, I had a day today where I figured out what you meant by priceless. Yeah, it's the wind, the water, the rain, the trees, the earth, the tansies, the soap lilies, the daisies, the fireweed bursting in the summer, the apples on the tree in the fall. It's the life you want. There is no better life. That's the life everyone dreams of, and here it is. And the weirdness of it all is some want to sell and some want to stay. The end.
And then at the end, and then this question of working in law with people around those conflicts, figuring out what is the way to resolve that. when you have people who have such divergent understandings of what it is that they're fighting for and what they're struggling for, right? And how to resolve or solve those kinds of problems.
Okay. Okay, because I want to say something about Earl. Because I'm a very practical person, I pretty well am I'm on a very conservative side of every choice to make. Earl, however, has spent his life as a salesman, and Glenn told me he's a really good salesman. That, for example, he sold car tops. So bring your car in and he could make it look like a convertible. So he knew how to pander to that desire in a person to want to kind of look a little better than they are, be a little better than they are, of getting something for nothing or getting something to look like more than it's really worth. He really knows how to make the sell. So he made that sell to my sister Bonnie and my sister Darla and my brother Richard. They really believed that if we sold, that they would walk away with $2 million. And the truth is, as I told you, if we sold, probably there wouldn't be enough money in it just to buy, well, as I said, just the best car, maybe $60,000 car that you could buy. It's just not worth it. To me, I couldn't buy Earl's dream. I could just see that small check and walking away and losing all the other things around the land that we love, getting together, having picnics, meeting each other down at the water, going fishing with each other, swimming, treading water, laughter, fun, water fights. Hot dog roast, sitting around the fire at night, singing. One year, my job was to take all the children who wanted to down to the beach. And that year, my husband and I and all the children who were old enough had sleeping bags, and we slept out open. And when it was late and they couldn't go to sleep, I became Star Lady. So I studied up on the stars, and as they were going to sleep, I could show them where all the constellations were, which stars were coming out. All that gets imprinted onto people, and it just doesn't seem worth it to sell all of that for the price of a new car. I can just use my old one, my old jalopy. My car is always 20 years behind the year that we're in. So if we're in 2020, you can bet my car is maybe 2000 or maybe 2002 model.
So this kind of takes us back in some ways, swings us back around to part of the beginning about thinking about what business is. So embedded in all of this is still these understandings. And I guess this is, if I were trying to pull the legal theory pieces back in for people, like back to Polanyi, questions about commodification or neoliberal understandings, or how to think about what wealth is and what business is and what's the place of business. So partly what we're seeing in here is also there's room for discussion about, is this business or is this not business? Because what we had or have had is some set of conversations about the work that a business structure does. So the work of LaRue, in fact, it is a business form, and it does hold things, it does facilitate things, it does move things, it does generate and hold wealth. But we've had very different understandings or conversations about how much wealth is held, how much wealth is distributed, what the forms of wealth look like, and challenges around both the clearly economic sides of the wealth and the other sides. Because LaRue has been a massive wealth generator for lawyers, right? also a site of a lot of learning for people, because the fight has sutured people to the land. Like, we now have 15 shareholders. So the generation behind has in fact invested their money into purchasing licenses, into purchasing shares, into kind of taking on the obligations to actually pay assessments, to continue to move wealth through and around the corporation as a way of maintaining those relations. So is that business? I mean, LaRue's business is ongoing.
Here's the thing is the wealth that's being moved around isn't cash. It's the wealth of learning from each other, of being with each other, of cementing friendships. I heard one of the new shareholders, Lainey Hicks, went to somebody on the other side and was trying to do some healing, but she said to them, "Who on your side can I trust?" She said, "I can trust everyone on our side. I can trust them enough to invest with them." So that's the kind of wealth that's being moved around. And what she's investing in clearing the land and building a house, in bringing her own children here and living close to her parents, and inviting other people from her family who haven't got the capacity to build. They still can come to the land. They can still bring a tent. I'm going to turn off my phone.
No, I kind of like it. It's a reminder that relations are moving. Other people in the family are like, "Why are you hogging mom, Rebecca?"
Who's there?
Hi, Grandma.
Hi, Grandma. It's Eb. Who is it?
It's
Oh, it's Eb giving me a phone call.
That's the best ever.